I'm reading The Laird and the Lady. It is a novel, a fiction by Joan Marshall Grant. She usually wrote books about her previous incarnations, but this one is a fictional book about a romantic encounter in a French chateau where the Laird meets the lady. She is an American millionaires and she travels incognito. Anyway, they got married. We're now in the second part of this book, and Marylda has met the grandmother of Rowan, who is quite a force to be reckoned with. We are here in the chapter 6, Highland Welcome, and I continue where it stopped yesterday. She is looking at the castle and she saw this staircase. At the foot of the stair, a postern door stood open to a wide apron of stone flags etched by a balustrade. She strode along, looking in through the tall, mullioned windows. The rooms Georgina had given up to them were over the library. On the far side of the hall was a sitting room which obviously belonged to Georgina, and then there were 3 more windows which were closed by interior shutters. She knew they must belong to the drawing room, which Rowan had told her had not been used since his coming-of-age ball. Its 6 east windows were partially obscured by a thicket of laurel that merged into a plantation of dark conifers. She noticed curved pinnacles thrusting up between the fir trees. Curiosity aroused, she forced her way among the interlaced branches until she came to a carved buttress. By it she pulled herself up to peer through the stained glass. Cobwebs hung down like a ragged chiffon curtain, and she could gain only an impression of emptiness and desolation. Had it been a chapel? Surely not, for even Georgina would not have let it fall into such neglect. She tore a strip of ivy from one of the elaborate mullions and realized that stone so little weathered must be much more recent than the rest of Cloud. Perhaps she had misjudged Georgina. Planting these trees so close to the house was not stupidity, only an attempt to hide errors of taste made by someone who had fallen under the influence of the Victorian Gothic revival. Would Rowan prefer it to be pulled down, or was it large enough to turn into a tennis court? There would be time enough to decide that after she had removed some of the more urgent horrors. The stag's head in the hall would have to go, though she knew that such trophies were not the easiest things to exile with wifely tact. She sat on the balustrade enjoying the genial warmth, happily unaware that it was considered a phenomenal heatwave by the inhabitants. Discontent at the interior of her home gradually gave way to pride in its setting. Yew hedges linked 4 levels of the herbaceous old borders, neglected but still brilliant, with peony and poppy, delphinium and late lupins. Beyond the ranks of flowers, which were protected by a ha-ha from the white Highland castle that drowsed under park timber, the ground fell steeply to the river that was bright as polished metal on the green valley. 4 or 5 miles to the south, the mountain range reared up from the foothills, the peaks streaked with snow even at midsummer. A small open car came down the road beyond the river and crossed the bridge. Marylda watched its approach with annoyance. Was she supposed to cope with callers, or could she trust Agnes to send for Rowan or Georgina? If someone stayed to lunch, it would spoil the afternoon as effectively as Georgina had contrived to spoil the morning. A few minutes later, a girl came out of the postern door, saw Marylda and said, "Oh, hello, I didn't know anyone was here." She was tall and rather heavily built, with hair of the color which can be described either as red gold or carroty, according to the eye of the beholder. Marylda decided she could do no less than appear hospitable and said, "Rowan's gone off somewhere with his grandmother. They are sure to be back for lunch, and of course you'll stay for it." Of course, in fact Georgina's asked me to stay for a fortnight. Oh, has she? Thought Marylda. Another of Granny's happy little schemes. Perhaps I'm being unfair. She may be a secretary or something. Further inspection of the girl's clothes convinced her that this more charitable view was probably correct. There's nothing to be feared from someone who wears a tweed skirt and ginger brown and adds it to a shirt cut like a man's, with a tie held down to an ample chest with a brooch of a bird's claw set in silver. Had Marylda been able to read the thoughts aroused by an equally critical inspection of herself, she would have felt less amiable. How on earth did this female get asked to Cloud? I suppose some men might think her quite attractive if her ridiculous clothes didn't put them off. The white Angora jersey is all right, but violet corduroy slacks? Surely Rowan didn't invite her. Darling Rowan, at times he is such an ass. Still, one must be civil. Cigarette? The girl offered, dragging a battered packet of Players from the pocket of her skirt. Marylda smiled, trying to put this uncouth stranger at ease, and flicked her gold lighter into flame for them both. The girl blew smoke down her nose and inquired, "Have a good journey?" "Not at all bad. We only arrived this morning." So Rowan had travelled north with her? She must have catched an invitation, but she wouldn't stay long. "Rowan's been in France," she said. "I know, I met him there." "Must be beastly hot in France. The rivers are low enough here. Salmon almost scrape the bottom, and trout are too lazy to take a fly. You fish?" "No," said Marylda. "Should I?" "Lots of people prefer shooting. Dull for them between February and August, unless they are amused by rabbits." "I haven't been really amused by rabbits since I was 11. Then someone left the hutch open and they escaped. I'm afraid I don't shoot or fish or even hunt." This was excellent news. Rowan would be bored in a week with a female who was not only entirely useless, but boasted of the fact. Better temper the wind a bit. "I'm afraid you'll find it rather dull here, but the scenery is magnificent, if you like that sort of thing." "I'm devoted to scenery," said Marylda, and then realized that the sarcasm was wasted, or was it? For the girl seemed to find the silence embarrassing. "By the way, in lieu of introduction, we can exchange names. I'm Janet Cairdry." "I am Marylda Cairdry." Of course, Duncan had written a postcard from Paris saying he had met a new cousin, probably one of the remote branch that had emigrated to Canada. She was Duncan's problem, not Rowan's. Damn lucky I didn't drop a brick. How naughty of Duncan not to tell me you were coming to stay here until he gets back to Dalloch. Janet was almost arch. Dear old Duncan, how she and Rowan would tease him. Duncan is driving Rowan's car north next week. It broke down in France. It didn't break down. There was no room for it on the boat, so Rowan left it at Calais. For a moment, Janet was resentful that this woman presumed to know so much about Rowan's affairs. Then her frown cleared. Rowan must have told her in the train. They had to talk about something, and it must have been pretty tricky for him to find topics that she could understand. Rowan wouldn't like her much, or he wouldn't have left her alone the morning she arrived. Would Georgina look after her, or would she be left on their hands until Duncan got home? They heard a whistle. "There's Rowan," said Janet, instinctively tucking a wisp of hair into place. The gesture was not lost on Marylda. Perhaps it would have been kinder to break the news that she was Rowan's wife. But why should she have done, when Janet had deliberately tried to point out that she was not the kind of person who belonged to Cloud? Rowan walked towards them along the terrace, trying to convey a nonchalance he did not feel. It was idiotic of Georgina to let Janet come here, without giving him a chance to tell her about Marylda. Ought he to kiss her? They drifted into the habit of kissing when they met. Not that it meant anything, a mere cousinly gesture, but Marylda mightn't understand. Janet saved him the decision. She had no intention of letting this newcomer be under any illusion as to her status. After all, they were practically engaged, though Rowan hadn't made a formal proposal. She ignored his outstretched hand and kissed him with greater warmth than she had previously allowed herself to display. Over her shoulder, Rowan saw Marylda smile. Thank God she hadn't taken it the wrong way. But had she told Janet? No, she couldn't have done, or Janet wouldn't have been so tactless. Or was the old girl playing up to show they had nothing to hide? He sat on the balustrade between them. The silence became increasingly solid. He broke it with undue heartiness. What do you think of my wife, Janet? Marylda saw the colour drain slowly from the other girl's face. Oh, Rowan, that was brutal. No, it's my fault. I ought to have given her a chance to hide her feelings. What would I feel like if I'd heard Rowan say that about someone else? It would be like being told by a doctor that you'd got leprosy. So you're married, said Janet. My voice sounds quite ordinary. This must be what it feels like to be badly wounded. A knowledge that it's happened, but one still doesn't really believe it. We were married in Paris, said Rowan. Georgina didn't tell me. She didn't know until yesterday. I see, said Janet. Of course, you'd have to tell Georgina before anyone else. How did she take it? Was her voice all right? Mustn't sound too casual. Try to pretend you're talking about two other people. Interested, amused, excited at being allowed to share a new bit of gossip. Georgina's in very good form. I told her we stayed at the Ritz, and instead of asking what the bill was, she said, perfectly amiable, that it must be a good hotel, because Hector went there when he was in Paris. He must have been on his honeymoon, too. Yes, said Rowan, I suppose he was. Stupid of him to mention Hector. The last thing he had meant to do was say anything that could make either of them associate Marylda with the other American wife. How could he change the subject without being obvious? Isn't it nearly lunchtime? Said Marylda. Trust Marylda to say the right thing. The gong went ages ago, he exclaimed, as though declaring the relief of a siege. Georgina was carving a leg of mutton at the sideboard when they reached the dining room. Marylda wondered whether she was supposed to sit at the head of the table. Rowan had not decided this point either. As his wife, it was her proper place, but would Georgina resent being ousted from her usual chair? They stood in embarrassment, watching Georgina carve, until she said over her shoulder, Marylda at the head of the table. Marylda hesitated, uncertain whether she was expected to protest. Rowan saved her further indecision by drawing her out her chair. Only Rowan enjoyed the mutton and new potatoes, the peas and mint sauce, being greatly relieved that the three women appeared to be settling down so well together. Georgina took a second helping of raspberry tart, a gesture to show that nothing should be allowed to upset an excellent digestion. Also, it was a good example for Janet, though she knew very well how difficult it must be for her to swallow, against tears that pride could not allow to fall. Curious how even trivial things maintained a pattern. The freezing salt in the ice at Hector's engagement dinner, and now the cream for the raspberry tart was slightly turned. She must tell Mrs. MacTaggart to be more careful. I believe Georgina understands, thought Janet. She won't offer sympathy unless it's decently done. Whiskey in my bedroom tonight, but nothing will be said. Georgina had to wait for Hector. She will help me to be clever. Marylda found the long silences disconcerting, having yet to learn that in Scotland trivial conversation is not considered a useful accomplishment. She watched Janet accept a second helping of pastry and decided that if the girl had been in love with Rowan, she couldn't have retained such a hearty appetite. Or was it British phlegm? That extraordinary capacity for appearing unmoved in a crisis which made them so difficult to understand? Rowan wondered whether it would be possible not to include Janet in the plans for the afternoon, and reluctantly decided that to do so would be tactless as well as ill-mannered. We'll take Marylda to the kennels, he said, as they got up from the table, and we can pay our respects to Robbie at the same time. He held open the door for the younger woman to leave, knowing that Georgina would stay behind to see that the scraps from the plates were collected for the dogs. Damn, he ought to have warned Marylda not to smoke between courses. Not that it mattered, but they had better to walk wearily until the ice was rather less thin. That he was doing his best to make the thin ice even thinner was a fact of which he was fortunately unaware. "Are the puppies ready to wean yet?" said Janet as they crossed the courtyard. "Robbie thinks they're one of the best litters we've had since we mated Cairdre Bracken to Strongheart of Cloud." "I haven't seen them since I got home," said Rowan, "but anyway, you're to take your pick." "Would it be rude to ask who Robbie is and what breed of dog we're going to inspect?" inquired Marylda, who found it irksome to be excluded from the conversation. "Golden retrievers," said Rowan. "Robbie is a very important member of Cloud," said Janet. "Don't be upset if you find him rather brusque. He is always a bit difficult with strangers." Rowan was annoyed with Janet for what he considered a typical tactless remark. Robbie, in the old days, was the family piper and had Gilly. Then he became the only Gilly, and now he looks after the dogs. He's quite famous in these parts as a trainer. The Cloud strain does pretty well at field trials and on the bench. Janet takes the dogs to the shows. Don't know what we would do without her. Marylda would have liked to retort, "Well, I can promise that you'll find out before long," but managed to remain silent. "Oughtn't we to translate?" said Janet. "How can Marylda be expected to know our barbarous language? A gilly is the same as a keeper, only to do with fishing." "We have keepers in America too, and not only in lunatic asylums. We also have fish," said Marylda. "And bagpipes," said Rowan. "We are familiar with the principle. We have most educative advertisements for whiskey." "And nearly all the whiskey," said Janet sharply. "It is difficult not to be a little bitter that it has to be sent abroad." "For our dollars. I understand how you feel." "Economics are quite beyond the capacity of any normal brain," said Rowan firmly, "and I refuse to take sides." "Oh, do you?" thought his wife, "even when she is deliberately trying to insult me? Surely you're not going to allow yourself to grovel in front of this female," thought Janet. Rowan, an arm linked with each young woman, considered he had been a master of diplomacy to have smoothed over an incident which had looked like developing into a tricky situation. Robbie was sitting on a bench beside the front door of his cottage. A path edged with stones meticulously matched and whitewashed divided his front garden into two exact halves. On the right side were precise rows of vegetables, on the left a border of marigold and stock, nasturtium and mignonette, lineal descendants of those plants by his wife, who had been dead over 30 years. He pretended to be surprised to see his visitors, though his pearl tie pin, worn only on occasions of ceremony, was proof that he was awaiting their arrival. Marylda's most vivid impression was a hand clasp of real friendship, and blue eyes that, in spite of a setting of wrinkles, had a remarkable discernment. He led the way into the parlour, where whiskey and glasses were set out on an oak table by the small window. "We will take a dram to drink her ladyship's health," he said hospitably, "and I hope she will overlook the fact that I was not at the castle this morning to pipe her home." So I was not wrong to expect a different welcome, thought Marylda, and Robbie would have been the piper who walked in front of the car. "Thoughts worth a penny?" asked Rowan a little sharply. She realized that Robbie was holding out a glass filled to the brim with whiskey. He was also looking at her very intently, as though aware of her abstraction, yet not offended. "I was wondering how long I must wait before I can hear the pipes. If Robbie is kind, it won't be very long." Robbie smiled. Obviously, she had said the right thing. "There'll be plenty of time for that," he said cordially, "but I know Miss Janet would prefer to see the puppies." He led the way to the kennels, which were close to his cottage. Each had a tiled yard enclosed by iron railings. The puppies, still woolly as teddy bears, occupied Janet's attention. She picked up each in turn, discoursing learnedly on their points. In the end kennel, a young golden retriever pawed at the gate, whimpering to be let out. "How's she coming along?" asked Rowan. "She's as pretty a bitch as we've bred for 5 years, said Robbie, "but gun-shy. At the sound of a shoot, down goes her tail, and there's yellow streak running for home." "Good enough for show?" asked Janet. "If so, I'll take her home with me and get her used to the bench." Robbie hesitated. "We have never shown a gun-shy dog yet. I doubt if it would be a good precedent." "Well, I'll take her anyway," said Janet. "There are some new people who've bought the White House on the road to Darwin. They've got children, and I've heard they're looking for a pet. It's a pity she'll never be any use, but we ought to get 6 or 7 guineas for her." Robbie unlatched the kennel gate. Janet clicked her fingers, but the bitch ran to Marylda and jumped up, tried to lick her face. "Sit," commanded Janet, but the bitch took no notice. "Shall I sell her, Rowan?" But it was Marylda who replied, "No, you won't. She's mine. You see, I happen to prefer a dog who isn't expected to do anything. I think she's an angel, so I shall call her Angela." "You can't do that," said Janet patronizingly. "All her litter have names beginning with S. It makes it easier to keep track in the kennel book." Angelina and I couldn't know less about the kennel book. From now on, she will sleep in my room and have no traffic with the kennel dogs, who would only annoy her by making sneering remarks. "Dogs don't sleep in the house," said Janet, delighted at this opportunity to point out another social error. "Angela will therefore have the chance to set an example. I always had dogs in my bedroom until I came to Europe." "Lapdogs are different," said Janet with scornful indulgence. What a fool the girl was to suppose Rowan would be tolerant of pickies and dachshunds. "I hardly consider boxers can be described as lapdogs," retorted Marylda. "We Americans need large, fierce dogs to guard us from the immigrants. No doubt in Scotland you rely on the thickness of your castle walls, or the thickness of your skins." She turned on her heel and left them, the dog leaping at her side. "I can consider myself thoroughly snubbed," said Janet, ruefully, trying to conceal how pleased she was that Marylda had played into her hands. "Well, you bought it," said Rowan, who had been prepared to be annoyed with his wife, but was not going to allow anyone else to gloat. "You're not really going to let her have a dog in our bedroom?" "In our bedroom. Hadn't it occurred to you that I may be glad to give my wife anything that pleases her?" She shrugged. It was hardly a gift. She merely announced that she was taking her. And why not? Everything I have belongs to Marylda too, so it was entirely unnecessary for her to ask. "But it would have been more tactful, or has she trained you to be less touchy?" "I hardly think you are in a position to give lessons in tact." "Well, I hardly think you are in a position to give lessons in tact. And then understand this. If Marylda wants a dog in the house, it stays in the house. And anyone who doesn't like the new arrangement can leave. Georgina won't like it." "Oh, damn Georgina." Rowan went to find his wife. Janet to the woods to cry in decent privacy. Robbie managed to conceal his elation until they were out of sight, and then returned to his cottage to drink another toast to the Lady of Cloud. Robbie knew what had happened to the other American bride. This time his friendship could be more effective. He smiled to himself, content that Rowan, whom he loved better than his own children, had found a wife who was not only more than a match for Janet and the old lady, but would rouse him until he no longer permitted himself to be bullied. Robbie gave the matter further consideration. The two women would do their best to make things difficult for the bride. However, he was not without influence. Tonight he would summon those who could be trusted to respect his judgment, and tell them that they were to do everything in their power to smooth the path of the newcomer. The people he could rally to her defense carried considerable weight. Mrs. MacTaggart, his daughter, who ruled the housekeeper's room, though now she was also cook with a single kitchen maid. Agnes, his niece, and a parlour maid. His grandchildren, Elsie, the housemaid, sister to Sandy, who had already reported favourably on the Laird's choice. Should Anderson be included in the conference? He was only a brother-in-law, but under these special circumstances he could be regarded as kin. But Anderson would require a bait before his cooperation could be assured. Robbie chuckled. He would tell Anderson that the new lady of the house would wish him to grow carnations. That given suitable encouragement, it was not unlikely that before long he would regain his status in local flower shows instead of being no better than a mere grower of fruit and vegetables for sale. The other 3 gardeners would not require instruction. Anderson was not tolerant of indiscipline in the ranks. He took his pipe and paced up and down the path, playing the welcome of Cloud. This was the end of chapter 6. Chapter 7 is entitled Embroidery.